And we are live. Very good morning to everyone from China. And it's almost lunchtime, I guess, in Australia. With me today for, I think, the third or fourth time is Robbie Barwick of the Australian Citizens Party, my favorite preferred candidate for Prime Minister of Australia. And I think I'm going to read, if you don't mind, Robbie, before I introduce you, I would like to read this. Unless Robbie Barwick becomes PM of Australia, nothing will change. And that's from one of my followers, PL Fong, the other day, who didn't know I was going to interview you today. And I said, I'm going to interview Robbie in a few days. I'll read that one out to him. What do you think about that?
Tell him I'm working on it, but I'm not making that a condition of change in Australia, because that's quite a long shot. Me getting elected Prime Minister. I'm hoping to get elected a senator for Victoria, so I'll work very hard on that. And I will be a very, very loud, clear voice in Parliament on these issues, with none of the equivocation. Like on some of these issues, the Greens aren't too bad, but they tend to equivocate on important aspects of it. I won't be doing any of that. I'll be absolutely clear. But I think we can push and expect change, even if I'm not Prime Minister.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not in Australia, and I'm not even sure how influential a voice I am in Australia. But I have now on YouTube. I've got 36,000 followers. On one of my Twitter accounts, I've got 85,000. So please, when you are campaigning, let me know, and I will do some campaigning for you from my base. Because I would like to see you in the Senate, at least in the Senate. I'd like to see more of you in there. And I'd very much like to see some changes in Australia. Because
we have to be careful a little bit, Jerry, because even though you're an Australian citizen, you are right. You're still a citizen?
Yeah.
Yeah. The xenophobes in this country, the McCarthyists, they will love to paint you as foreign interference.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that. Yeah. How can I be foreign interference when I'm Australian? Is that because I live in China?
Because you
more light on here.
Simply because you dare to have a positive view or a not negative view of China, the country that these hardcore xenophobes are trying to paint as the most evil country in the history of the world. They're so demented. They cannot tolerate anybody with a more moderate view than that. And so they go out of their way to demonize them. And there's nothing rational about this foreign interference hysteria that they have created. In fact, there's a man in prison in Melbourne, a Chinese Vietnamese Australian. So he's Chinese Vietnamese, and now then he moved to Australia. Sonny Duong. His only act was to donate $36,000 to a hospital, a children's hospital in the middle of COVID, and that was able to be twisted into an attempt at foreign interference, and he's now serving jail time for that.
Yeah, there was the trial was interesting because they actually put part of the trial in camera, which means that they closed the doors and kept the press out, and that indicates there's probably a little more to it than meets the eye. But it's certainly, on the media reports that I read, that looked like exactly what you just said. He did nothing more than make a donation, but he did specifically ask for Alan Tudge, I think it was, who was the Minister for Infrastructure, to be the person to receive the check, and that was his crime, asking for an important person. So he big noting himself, and he's serving
the actual act. So that's what I'm saying. The actual act was donating money to a hospital, not to a politician, to a hospital.
Yeah.
Everything else, and that's the reason why they had to have it in camera, is an interpretation of intent. And ultimately, they didn't even have to prove intent. Ultimately, it comes under the category of a thought crime, what happens in this national security space is they come up with these sweeping definitions that can be catch-alls and therefore applied fairly arbitrarily, and we, the public, just assume the law works in a certain way from growing up watching Perry Mason.
Wrong law.
Right? And so the public hasn't caught up with how broad these national security laws actually are. And therefore, with just the basic fact that even if someone has a conviction in this area, does not mean they're guilty. Right. So I'm not taking his conviction as proof of guilt. I'm using it as an example. This is the type of law we have to deal with now. Not to get too much of a downer on you, because I think it would be great if you help use your channel to make people aware of my campaign. But such is the nature of the xenophobes in this country, how they would think about it.
Well, and anything that you think I can do to help, let me know. But if you think I'm going to be a hindrance to your cause, then please let me know that too.
I'll ask James Patterson. He'll let me know. He'll make.
Oh yeah, he'll let you know for sure. Yeah. And Andrew Hastie and a couple of others in there would probably be have a thing. I doubt if Andrew Hastie knows who I am, but I've written about him a couple of times. Let's go on to what you are doing, because I want to come to the Premier's visit, and we'll have a long chat about how Australia and China are relating at the moment. But first of all, you've had some success in the banking industry, or the banking inquiry. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so we had a very major Senate inquiry into the banks, and specifically into banks closing branches in regional towns. It should have been an inquiry into banks closing branches everywhere, but as it happened, once we got this inquiry up by targeting this particular committee that deals with rural and regional affairs of the Senate, because people on that committee were sympathetic to this problem that needed to be addressed. Once the inquiry was up, then all the politicians tried to jump on the bandwagon and express concern as well. And I'm thinking, well, if you hadn't have been such cowards when it came to the banks and were more forthright, we could have made it an even bigger inquiry. But as it was a very large inquiry. It went for 15 months. It had conducted 13 very powerful public hearings. Muggins made a commitment at the beginning to attend every one of them, and I did. And so I've been everywhere, man. I'm map behind me. I've literally been everywhere, including, let me just indulge me for a second. I've never been to, this is Cloncurry.
Right.
And I'd never been there before, even though I'm a Queenslander. And this is a place called Tom Price. And these are very remote places.
I've never heard of Tom Price.
Well, it used to be. Here's a funny story about Tom Price. That's all iron ore country out there.
Of course, yeah.
It used to be called Mount Tom Price. The reason it's not Mount Tom Price anymore is because the mountain is in China. They dug it up and they put it on ships and they sent the mountain to China in the form of. It's now the mountain is in your steel tracks.
It's probably 42,000 kilometers of rail. Yeah.
That's right. So the town is left, and there's still iron ore mining there. So it's just called Tom Price now.
Wow.
But anyway, what happened was the process is the best part of the way our democracy works. Oh, can I make an aside? 2 days ago, I informed an Australian parliamentarian that Chinese people all have the right to vote. All adult Chinese have the right to vote. He had no clue. He'd never. He just assumed
in China.
In China, yeah. He just assumed there was no voting in China, etc. Anyway, every country has its own system of, and there are aspects of every system that are quite sincere, because it's even the worst, even the most megalomaniacal dictatorship cannot survive unless it has its finger on the pulse of what the public are feeling.
Yes.
Right? You want to be on side with that. Nikolai Ceausescu learned what it was like when you're not on side with what the public's feeling. Right? So the smart ones have to be, they all know you've got to find how to get the feedback. So we in the West say we have these things called democracies. Every 3 years or 4 years, people get to vote. Well, that's actually not a good enough system, because if you just rely on that for your feedback, then you're gonna miss the shifts in public opinion. In our parliament, as dysfunctional as it is, we have this system of committees that the Senate, mainly operating through the Senate, also through the House, but mainly through the Senate, and they can be very effective. And a lot of our work in Australian politics as a party in the last few years has been being heavily engaged with these committees and getting issues addressed quite effectively. This was the biggest one we've ever done, and we helped to drive this inquiry. And we said all along, look, there's a win-win solution here. I shamelessly borrowed from Xi Jinping's rhetoric on the win-win thing, right? There's a win-win solution here, and that is, if the banks don't want to provide services, we have post offices in Australia that there's more post offices than there are all bank branches combined. We should use those to be the branches of a public bank, a government-owned bank, a postal bank. And we haven't had a government bank for 25 years in Australia, and that's because that was privatized. And that's why the banks have gone rogue. They don't have to compete with a public bank anymore. And they've shown that they're not up to it. So bring back a public bank, operate it through post offices. You save postal services, because the revenue from banking can help support postal services, and you save banking services for all the communities in Australia, face-to-face services. So that was our argument all along. That's why we helped to get this up. But the senators got to hear the feedback from the towns. The feedback from those towns was unequivocal. It proved the banks were lying, because the banks were saying, "Oh, we're not driving some kind of agenda here. We're providing digital banking because that's what the public want. They don't want to go to branches anymore. They just want to do everything online." And these regional towns are saying, "Well, hang on. Even if that was, first of all, it's not true. We don't want to do everything online. And even if that was true, it won't work. It's impractical in a country like Australia, because the technology, the infrastructure is unreliable. And if you've got a country like us has to have cash, right, to be able to just keep transaction going, whatever the weather, whatever the natural disasters, whatever the state of the infrastructure, whether electricity is flowing or not. And that's why we need this. So, towns like Coober Pedy in the centre right there, let me move my finger a bit, in the middle of South Australia, 540 kilometres from the next town, and they lost their only bank. And those poor mugs have to drive 540 kilometres to bank. Because here's the thing, the bank just takes away the branch. Doesn't mean the people don't need to use a bank. They just don't have one locally anymore, and they've got to drive all that way. And then the banks are so cheeky or perverse, they actually turn around and claim these branches as counting towards their net zero carbon emissions targets. Even though they're forcing their customers to get in petrol and diesel guzzling cars to travel vast distances to the next branch. It's all totally perverse. Anyway, all this came out.
What does a full tank of petrol or diesel costs in remote regions like that? It was, when I was there, it was horrendously expensive. And that would be a full tank just to go to the bank and a full tank to get home again.
At least. No, it is absolutely horrendous. It's hundreds and hundreds of dollars to make that trip.
Wow. Right? It's worth it.
It's absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, so all this came tumbling out. And the reason it was a real victory for us is because when you have an inquiry like this, that's great. But what's the outcome going to be? What are the recommendations going to be? And I knew that the senators on this inquiry would come under enormous pressure from the lobbyists of the banks, who have enormous influence in our system. The good news is they defied that pressure, and they came up with incredibly powerful recommendations. And the second recommendation of 8, which means a priority recommendation, was that the government should establish an expert panel to look at the feasibility of establishing a public bank in post offices.
Why do they need a panel to decide?
We're actually quite happy with the recommendation. It's baby steps. They actually had an explanation of why, and the explanation was because they just focused on the question of branches and services. They themselves in the inquiry hadn't taken the time to do their own feasibility of how a public bank would work. Okay. They didn't. So they said, that needs to be done as a separate thing, right?
Mm.
The fact that they put it as number 2 recommendation so it can be done, that's and it's sort of, even for the people in Parliament who may not like this idea, the people who still want to suck up to the banks, it sort of makes the recommendation somewhat neutral and harder for them to say no to.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's okay, let's look at it. And we're winning public opinion to our side. And we know that if we get such a panel, they'll find it very, like, it'll come up with some good stuff. And we're already working hard to shape that. So there's a senator, not a senator, a very famous businesswoman in Australia, Christine Holgate.
Oh, yes.
She was the CEO of Australia Post, and Scott Morrison. At the same time,
until the Rolex watch scandal.
That's right. Cartier watches.
Cartier, sorry.
Yeah. Until at the same time, Scott Morrison was trying to single-handedly start World War III with China. He showed his true nature by bullying her out of her role as CEO of Australia Post, because she actually wanted a postal bank, and she'd made enemies of the banks in pushing for that. So,
which is presumably why she was removed from the post.
I'm 100% convinced that's why. And so we've nominated her to be the chair of that expert panel, because then we'll know it's in the right hands.
Right.
And there's she's got a lot of goodwill towards her now, because public opinion, well and truly, at first public opinion was against her because they made it look like she'd done a bad thing with the watches. Yeah. But when all the information came out, and we're the ones that made the information come out, the media didn't, we did it. And we shifted public opinion on her. A lot of goodwill towards her now. Politicians are trying to make up for for the wrong they did to her. And it would be a great thing if she was able to chair that panel, and it'll come up with a good model. We're pretty confident. And just last point on this, we're now getting a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon. So this last week, 2 of the biggest radio stations in Australia had me on. The big one in Melbourne and the big one in Perth. In fact, in Perth, I went into the studio for it. They had me on to talk in depth about this, and they're pushing it. They actually are behind this policy. They want it. So we're kicking goals in that area, and I think this is one policy fight we've had where we really could see this come to fruition. So we're very happy about that.
I'm going to segue from here, because I think there's a natural bridge to what we're here to discuss, which is the Chinese visit, the Premier's visit to Australia. But there is a natural segue here. And many people probably say, well, how did I link those 2 dots together? The banking situation in Australia is indicative of the problems that Australia has with China. Now, Christine Holgate lost her job because she offended the banking industry. Yeah. Who owns and controls the banking industry in Australia right now?
Well, pretty much the major controlling shareholding is American financial interests.
Right. Now, if they're controlling the banks and they can get rid of someone who says we can build a citizens bank, a publicly owned bank, a postal bank, whatever it happens to be, they basically, in order to salvage their own industry, which is declining as well because of their own reactions. Pretty much, it's a microcosm of the American economy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
If they can do that, this is what I see happening. When Premier Li visited, the day before he visited, we had a massive ASPI campaign for anti-China. The day after he visited, the media campaign is anti-China. While he was there, there was some positives. There's a new visa. You can come and visit, 15 days visa free, anytime you like. But I mean, that hasn't been implemented yet, but it's coming. There was 2 new pandas selected for Australia, which are apparently more fertile than the 2 you've already got. There's a few good things happening. And I believe personally, I mean, I love Australia. People think I don't. I do. I love Australia, and I would love dearly to live there again at some stage in the future. I mean, this is my home now, but I do love Australia. I'm more than I love the UK, I'm afraid. Sorry if there's any British people there who are offended by that. But I spent 28 years in the UK, 17 years in Australia, and I've been here 20 years. I've had a good opportunity to view them all. I do love Australia, and I want Australia to have a better relationship with its major trading partner, which I see as no threat. But suddenly, about 5, maybe 7 years ago, and maybe a little more than that, but around about the Turnbull era, it all changed, and Australia became very, very much virulently anti-China, and more so now. What happened? What's going wrong?
Well, there is a way to actually understand this in the context of the banking system.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give a plug here for a very interesting interview I saw recently, which is not every interview Tucker Carlson does is interesting. They're all big, but some are quite interesting. And this was the interview he did with Congressman Thomas Massie, who is a very curious character in the US Congress. And one of the reasons why is he actually has real integrity and sticks to his principles. If you ever see a vote, if you ever hear a report of a vote in the US House of Representatives, which is massively one-sided, so it's like 400 to 1, and there's quite a few of them, he's always the one, including on the anti-China votes. Now he's not some kind of pro-China guy necessarily, waving the flag for Xi Jinping. In fact, no one could ever accuse him of that. He just calls BS on all the hype and hysteria that is being used to push more funding for anti-China causes. Right? And he's always the no vote. Anyway, if you go watch that interview, he opens by they're talking about the US debt, $34 trillion, right? And how did that? Now, I'll just give you his comment, and then I'll come back to the point I was going to make. Tucker says to him, "How do we pay for this?" And he just explains really simply, if people like a simple explanation, how the only way America pays for its debt is by printing more money that they can only do because they are the world's reserve currency. And the minute that stops, it's all over for the American empire. It's all over. That's the bottom line. And so you see there how this financial reality of their economy drives America's geopolitical decisions, right? It's all about preserving that hegemony. The US dollar hegemony is what they're desperate to preserve, even though the more they do to preserve it, the more they're destroying it. But anyway, how did that debt come about? Well, we know the wars part. They spent a lot of money on wars, but it wasn't just that. And and just as big a part of that was in 2008, their deregulated banking system collapsed. And instead of reforming the banking system, instead of bringing back government authority over the banks, instead of cleaning them up, instead of bringing back this really effective policy called Glass-Steagall, the single most effective banking regulation in history that was in place from 1933 to 1999 in America, passed by Senator Glass and Congressman Steagall in 1933, or Senator Steagall and Congressman Glass. That's why it's called Glass-Steagall. It's their surnames, which meant that said banks that have deposits cannot do investment banking, which is the speculative stuff. There was a very simple law. There was a bridge between the two types of banking. Deposit banking had to be boring and super safe. You want to do speculative stuff, do it with your own money. No one's going to bail you out. That was the system for 66 years. It stopped systemic banking failures, banking crises in the United States, etc., like had been in the Great Depression, and it was perfect. And they repealed that in 1999, and 8 years later, the world literally blew up with all the speculation that got into it. So instead of recognizing that and saying, okay, we're going to go back to Glass-Steagall. The Chinese had actually copied. The Chinese saw in the 90s how successful Glass-Steagall was, and they copied. When they were designing their banking regulation post opening up, they copied that. And in 2007, there were debates in China saying, well, everyone else has got rid of Glass-Steagall, maybe we should too. and then the system blew up, and the debate changed to, I don't know, we're going to keep it. So instead of doing that, they went down the path of bailing the system out through money printing, right? Copious and copious and copious amounts of money printing. And it was quantitative easing in America, quantitative easing in Europe, quantitative easing in Japan. The Chinese money supply also increased dramatically at the same time, but the difference is where the money went, right?
Yeah.
Chinese money supply went into 42,000 kilometers of high-speed rail and the best infrastructure program in the history of the planet, literally, and theirs went into propping up banks. And so they created this problem to keep this system where the corporate power is greater than the government power. That's the plutocracies that run us now. We are not democracies. It's a joke. I get to vote, etc. But everyone knows that's why people think, voting's a waste of time. It never seems to change much because of course it doesn't, because we have this system that no one's prepared to take on, right? And so that's what's got them into this mess. And therefore, from the American side, the geopolitics started taking over in it actually started under Obama. People like to blame it all on Trump. No. The seeds were sown under Obama because they saw where this was going. And they said, okay, we cannot tolerate being number two. And in fact, I think Nicholas Burns actually gave a speech to that effect just recently, right? About competition with China. We'll never be number two. Yeah. The fact they want to think of it in those terms is why they have put us on the path to war. And then the last part of from the Australian perspective is we just went along with it, right?
Yeah.
Against our interests, we went along with every step of it.
Why do you think Australia goes along with it so? Without any, their largest trading partner is China, and there's never been a Chinese attack, a Chinese threat to Australia, but there is a perceived threat now. Why do you think? Why do you think they've gone that way, Australia?
Well, I'll say there's three parts, and I hope I remember the three as I'm going through them. The first part is there's a very old primal fear that Australia has for 150 years, the yellow peril. And it's always been played on. We are the white country in Asia, right? And isolated here in Asia. And it's always been played on. The only time there was ever any threat was from the Japanese in World War II. And China was our ally in helping to fight that, right? But otherwise, that's fundamentally it. That's one part. The second part is, and the third part is carrot and stick. So carrot is there's been this incredible foreign interference and influence campaign in Australia by the Americans, but it's vice versa. I don't want. I think this is a subtlety or a nuance people need to appreciate. In 1991, there was a businessman in Australia, Phil. Phil Scanlon.
Scanlon, yeah.
George W. Bush, George Bush Sr., the first President Bush, was visiting Australia. And Phil Scanlon was someone involved in right-wing politics in this country. And the official story is he was having an existential crisis because of the end of the Cold War. And he was losing sleep at night on this question of how do we keep the Americans in the Pacific so that we stay protected by them. That was the story. So he was having dinner with Bush and he proposed what was called the Australian-American, what has now become known as the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue. Mm-hmm. And so every year we swap where the venue is, but Australian politicians travel to the US or US politicians travel to Australia, and they get together and, talk and wine and dance and, have a good time. You can go onto the Australian American Leadership Dialogue's website. In fact, I encourage people to just look it up under those names, Australian American Leadership Dialogue. The best part about their website is their gallery, their photo gallery. And what you will see is lots and lots of photos of these events going back through the years. And if you know anything about Australian politics and American politics, you will recognize the people at these events, and including top media personalities. And they're always there. And And so this is overt foreign influence mongering in this country by the Americans. If the Chinese were doing anything like this, it would cause a meltdown. If the Chinese tried to do some arrangement like this, like, it would be so demonized. But this is the sort of stuff the Americans and the Brits and the Israelis do as a matter of course, and of course that's okay, right? But anyway, the first person I ever heard call this out was Paul Keating, and he called it out the day Donald Trump got elected. Paul Keating was on Late Line that night on the ABC, and he actually welcomed Trump's election in 2016 because of what Trump had been saying about, we're not going to be the policeman of the world. When we'll find a way to get on with Russia. We'll find a way to get, even though Trump had been was a blowhard on China in relation to trade issues and using horrible rhetoric. If you actually paid attention to what he was saying, you could distinguish between the trade rhetoric and just the general geopolitical rhetoric, right? He didn't want to be the policeman of the Pacific either, etc. And so Keating welcomed that, and he talked about how he responded to this very type of question you've just asked me, and he blamed it on this Australian-American leadership dialogue. He said, I never attended. He was the Prime Minister when it started. He never attended, but he saw his colleagues go to these events and come back forelock tugging to the Americans after that. They were firmly in the American camp. And you will see pictures of Albanese at these events on the gallery. If you want to go through the gallery, you'll see all those pictures there. And this is the carrot part. Like, this was a real charm offensive. The reason I say the nuance I want to express is this. It works both ways, because there is a hardcore neocon element in Australia as well. And so that, because Trump had these tendencies, the British and people in Australia helped to reinforce the neocons in America who were trying to make sure Trump never followed through on that sort of stuff. Right? So and the logic that we use in this country is we have to keep America engaged in the Pacific, because otherwise, how will we be protected? And when someone like me comes along and says, protected from what? Protected from whom? Where is the threat? Right? No, it's just got to be protected, and so it's an argument that only serves the military industrial complex and the American hegemony dollar system, right? And so anyway, that part of it is not just America influencing us. This dialogue is used for us to influence America too. Third part is the stick, and I think the stick is the most sinister, because I see a lot of it goes back to what happened to Gough Whitlam in the 1970s, the last prime minister to truly try to pursue foreign policy independence. We'd never had foreign policy independence in this country. My mate Malcolm Fraser wrote this book, the prime minister who succeeded Gough Whitlam, Dangerous Allies. Let me just put it up there.
I love the way you just say my mate Malcolm Fraser, like he is your best buddy.
He was.
Dangerous Allies, Malcolm Fraser.
He was. Malcolm, I got to know Malcolm quite well in his final years. He gave me, it might have been this copy. I remember when I was in the last time I visited him, he gave me a copy of this book, and he was really thrilled because it had just been published. And what he was really thrilled about was he'd come up with a blurb for the promotion of it. And the wording was, Australia needs an alliance with America for our security, but Australia only needs security because we're in an alliance with America. That's what he came up with to promote the book. But he was the politician who succeeded Gough Whitlam. And Gough Whitlam had Question Pine Gap, the American spy base right in the middle of Australia there, which is used to very important. It's the most important American base outside of the United States. He'd question those sort of things. He tried to pursue an independent foreign. He opened up relations with China. He tried to pursue an independent foreign policy in many ways. There's a clip going around Twitter at the moment that people may have seen, where someone dug up him in 1985 talking about a reference in his memoirs from when he was prime minister in the 70s to being blackmailed. And they said, who blackmailed you? And he said, Jewish community leaders here who were trying to force Australia to take a side in the 1973 war. And what he said then in that clip by modern standards, he would have been denounced every way to Sunday. So he was a very independent kind of person. Yeah. And he essentially got overthrown by the CIA and MI6. And we've documented all that. There's a whole story there. And ever since then, the Labor Party especially has been increasingly fearful. Now, he was replaced by Fraser. Fraser kept the general Cold War type policies going. He was on the opposite side, etc. But funnily enough, after Fraser left office, he and Whitlam gravitated closer and closer together, so that by the 21st century, Malcolm Fraser, he worked so hard to stop the Iraq War, tirelessly to try and stop the Iraq War, and then stop Australia following America down this path. And he wrote one of the points he made. So he had this epiphany. He wrote this point that we've never been an independent country, and the only time we came close was really under Whitlam. And because of what happened to him, I'm strongly of the view, Jerry, that subsequent governments of all types, especially Labor governments, have been increasingly ultimately scared to buck the system.
So you think the system is basically what you're saying now is America is controlling every aspect of Australian political life?
Well, America and the Brits, it's always been the Brits. But it's an Anglo-American thing that we're dealing with, and that's actually one of the reasons it's so powerful here, because we are so anglicized. Like, the Queen or the King now is our head of state and all that kind of stuff. It's always been that, and now it's more an Anglo-American empire. But those same structures, that the establishment, the Brits are living out their imperial fantasies through the Americans now anyway. Right. They're joined at the hip. In fact, in terms of the financial system they're trying to protect, a whole chunk of it is actually run out of the UK, and it's Wall Street and City of London working hand in hand. The Brits control all the world's offshore tax havens that are the equivalent of pirates that sit there and undermine the tax regimes of countries, right? And no one touches them. I mean, every country in the world who are serious about getting ripped off from the, if all the blue collar workers who have to keep paying higher and higher taxes so that rich people and rich corporations can escape tax. It's all possible because of these offshore tax havens, and they're all controlled by the British, and it's intimately tied in with the this corrupted American plutocratic system. And so that's always been our control in Australia, and the Americans have just been able to come in on top of that. And yeah, it's total control. And before 2016, we didn't, no one who would have said Citizens Party would have instantly said China. Nowadays, anyone says Citizens Party, they say, oh, they're pro-China. We never had to talk about it. It wasn't an issue. The only time we ever talked about China is we would talk about, hey, did you see the latest news from China's infrastructure projects? That's pretty impressive. Yeah. We should be doing that sort of thing here. But it became, we started noticing the kind of crap. And this is one example, was there was this big scandal started brewing about Chinese investment in Australia. And every time a Chinese company would buy some asset in Australia, it was a headline, Chinese buying up Australia, blah, blah, blah. And at a certain point, we thought, okay, this is ridiculous. Let's just go look at the figures. And it's all there on the DFAT website. And the Chinese total foreign investment was tiny. It was always tiny. It was like
less than 2% of the entire foreign investment of Australia. And that included Hong Kong.
Exactly. But while all the attention was on that, here's what people aren't talking about, is just how much of Australia the Americans and the British own. Enormous chunks of Australia. Absolutely enormous.
Have you seen, in fact, no, I know you've seen it because it was you alerted me to it, the Clinton Fernandez article about the top 20 organizations. You alerted me to that, and I've written about that and used that link that you sent me, where I believe there are 15 of the top 20 corporations that are controlled by America. And this includes all the banking, all the retail, most of the agriculture, most of the mining and resources. So 15 of the top 20 are controlled. 3 of the remaining 5 have a very strong 30+% influence from America. And the other 2 are Australian. And those 20 companies make up 60% of Australia's economy.
And this
That's
is,
worrying.
well, but you know what? This is another generational shift in terms of how bad things are now, because this was an enormous debate in the 1970s, and the 60s and the 70s. It was a huge debate in Australia over all this foreign control of our economy. It wasn't about China.
No.
That the politicians then were worried about British and American ownership of Australia. And so Gough Whitlam got elected in 1972 on the platform called Buy Back the Farm. And it wasn't buying it back from the Asians, it was buying it back from the Brits and the Americans. That's what he had a minister named Rex Connor, who was the driving force behind that campaign. They worked tirelessly to try and take Australian ownership of especially our minerals, was the big one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the big owners, it was all American and British, and the British especially was enormous. So they tried to, and then you really see how the financial power of Anglo-American control works, because they went to the banks in London and Wall Street that we always borrowed from as an Australian government. All our history, the same banks, Morgan Grenfell in London and whoever it was in Wall Street. We'd always borrowed from the same banks for a century. So they said to them, okay, we want to borrow for this purpose. Those banks said, no, we're not going to lend to you. Rex Connor gets up in Parliament, and this was a credit strike against Australia, because our government was trying to implement a sovereign policy. Funnily enough, they weren't trying to buy out existing assets. What they were trying to do is make sure that future projects in Australia were majority Australian owned. Rex Connor gave a speech in Parliament in 1973 pointing out that we're trying to borrow $4 billion, which was a lot of money at the time, against assets that were worth at least $6 trillion, right? And the banks were turning us down. And it was because we got blocked, because of this credit strike. Then they went to the Saudis, who were rolling in oil money. The King of Saudi Arabia was initially interested in lending to Australia, and then inexplicably they changed their mind, because, of course, the Saudis were in this very close relationship with the Brits and Americans. Mm-hmm. So then, if you know, for those, I'm just saying this for people who might be familiar with Australia. We won't go through all the details, but it was then that the third step was this thing that became known as the loans affair, where a broker named Tirith Kimlani from Pakistan said that he could get us the money, and that all ended in tears. But that was the process, and the motivation was to assert sovereign control and ownership of our resources. So how come we had politicians who actually saw the Brits and Americans as foreign, not in sinister ways, but as unacceptable foreign owners of our country then, 50 years ago, and now all the politicians think it's entirely acceptable?
They saw the threat that Australia now faces, and the threat is US hegemony preventing Australia from growing any further. In fact, probably it will cause the downfall of Australia, because they can't deal with their largest trading partner. I see that China would like Australia to become the major supplier for the BRI. They've got the resources. China's got the customers. There's a fantastic relationship there, but it does put all of the eggs in one basket for Australia. However, it's one extremely large basket, and you've historically proven to be quite a safe basket to put them into. The only issue is America. Now, let's go on to a few days before Premier Li arrived in Australia. The Foreign Investment Review Board required a Chinese business person to divest his shares and his corporation shares in 2 rare earth mining corporations. Do you think that's a pattern of things that are going to happen more and more in the future? And if you were, putting on a very different cap, if you were a Chinese businessman, Would you consider Australia to be a safe place to be doing business right now?
No. Though, look, I'm happy to. I suspect the Chinese side of our relationship are very clearly people, right? So they're encouraging a certain approach, and if they're happy to encourage their side, to the companies on their side to do the deals, far be it for me to undermine them. They would be aware of what I'm about to tell you, because what I'm about to tell you is that we now have an absolute bias against the Chinese in the political decision making that governs the economy. Yeah, it's been there for a while. In terms of the Foreign Investment Review Board, it was about 2018, 2019 that they adopted an explicitly discriminatory policy against China, so that all Chinese investment, there's a threshold. There's a threshold, financial threshold, before the Foreign Investment Review Board assesses purchases, right, which is tens of millions of dollars. It's got to be above that threshold. Anything below that is considered not that important. That applies to all countries, but in 2019 or 2018, they dropped that for China, just China, they dropped it to zero. So every Chinese purchase now has to be assessed against that. All Chinese purchases, regardless, must be assessed. It's totally discriminatory, and it's on the back of that hysteria that was never true about Chinese investment in Australia, right? So now total Chinese investment's actually shrinking. So that discrimination's there. That's a huge problem. And the other one is the context and the other laws associated with the American Inflation Reduction Act, because under that Inflation Reduction Act, which is a seemingly neutrally worded thing, Australia and Albanese was boasting about this, that Australia has now been brought in, the only other country outside, except for Canada, brought into America's military industrial complex system, but what they call it, military supply. There's probably some smart people listening who know what I'm talking about. It's
supply chain.
It's their defense industry supply chain, whatever the particular term is, right? But that comes with strings attached, because once you sign up to that arrangement, then the president of America gets to say what you do with your resources. Right. And the number one strategic resource is fast becoming lithium, and these other rare earth things. So there's a massive mine down in this is actually the part of the world my wife's from, this WA here. WA. There's a massive lithium mine there that the Chinese did all the work to develop. In fact, they might have even been in partnership with an American company, a Chinese company in America. I might be wrong on that, but I know the Chinese.
That does happen.
Yeah. So it was all fine. They've developed this huge mine, a lot of lithium coming out of there, and suddenly, then that's a big issue. So all of that kind of the fact that can happen to that decision can be made, that you're going to see that more and more, because the American side is going to insist on muscling out the Chinese from these control of these resources, right? So that's if you're on the Chinese side, you have to weigh that up. That would be a huge issue when you make those decisions.
Did you see the Mike Pizzullo article, the challenges?
Well, I had a visceral reaction to that article, actually.
So you did see it?
Yeah, I thought I crossed the red line, because I wrote an editorial for our magazine on the base of that article, where I called him out as a traitor to Australia, and I'm going to do that more, because I couldn't believe what I was reading. This is just from context. This is a guy who should probably be in jail.
Yes.
He was a minister. He was a department head, but he always worked in tandem with Peter Dutton. So Peter Dutton is now the opposition leader, but he was the Home Affairs Minister in the previous government and the Defence Minister. And in both roles, Pizzullo was his department secretary, so the top bureaucrat of the department. And these two worked in tandem. Huge amount. There's lots of corruption associated with the sort of things they ran. Like, if you want to see how real unbridled corruption in Australia, go look at the contracts handed out to run offshore detention in Nauru and Manus Island, where they give these companies, security companies, hundreds of millions of dollars to run these hellholes.
$47 million for a 62-day contract was one of them.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. And so these guys were doing it. So the idea that they have in any way credibility is amazing. But remember, this Pizzullo was forced out of government a little while ago, and we don't know the full story how the messages leaked, but his text messages leaked that showed he used his position as a powerful bureaucrat given extra power by Dutton to actually manipulate who got appointed ministers in the government. And every aspect of that government, that Morrison government structure was sinister. So under Scott Morrison, when he was the Prime Minister, he secretly signed himself into like 5 ministries as the minister. Yeah. And so Scott Morrison had more power than any other Prime Minister in the history of Australia, but he gave it to himself secretly. This guy Pizzullo was a top bureaucrat in that administration, manipulating who gets made a minister. The cabinet, which is under our system, the cabinet is made up of ministers who are made up of parliamentarians. So the Prime Minister and his ministers are parliamentarians, and the Prime Minister represents the majority in the House, and he picks the cabinet. These are all supposed to be elected people. They installed in that cabinet as cabinet secretary this guy who this American like loyalist Andrew Shearer, who was a bureaucrat. Paul Keating called this guy out last year as one of the people who had pushed us down the war to China path. He was the cabinet secretary. They had the head of ASIO, the domestic security agency, and the head of ASIS, the foreign security agency, permanently ensconced in the cabinet as well. This was like a coup that had taken over Australia for the purpose of pushing us down this war path with China. And then Pizzullo, like, they lost government, and so Albanese, to his credit, I'll give him, has tried to stabilize the relationship with China and do things differently. He ended some of these arrangements. He didn't kick out Andrew Shearer, though. But Pizzullo was exposed for trying to, secretly manipulate who the government would be. So he had to resign. I would argue he should probably be in prison. Instead, I started seeing it a few months ago, and this Aspie article is the culmination of it. There's been this operation to rehabilitate this guy. Mm-hmm. Why? And on what subject? China. We've got to bring Pizzullo back because he's an expert on this China subject. And what he wrote in that article, and people can go to the Strategist, which is it's on the Aspie website. Look up Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Read the article. It is so chilling. He lays it all out there, and that our objective as a country is to maintain American hegemony of the world. So we don't have an independent foreign policy purpose. Mm-hmm. It's all to serve the American agenda. He attacks anything that might try to balance that as against our sovereignty, even though he's defined our sovereignties in terms of being submissive to the United States, right? So anything that goes against that is he thinks he has the right to call an attack on our sovereignty. And then he slams Albanese for a lot of his diplomacy, but then he lays it all out by actually saying, but even though everything I've said about Albanese is that way, in terms of his actions, though, he's stuck with the program. And what's the program? The program is handing over Australia to be a base for America's war with China. It'll be run from here, and handing control of our military to the Americans. And I'm reading this.
Who's going to pay for it if they have no trade with China?
Good question. But look, maybe we'll get some of the $36 trillion in debt sloshing through here. But I'm reading this stuff and I'm thinking, what has happened to our self-respect as a nation that here's a guy laying out, he's an American agent at the top levels of our government, super powerful position. Why aren't these people you can be friends with a country like America, but you don't let them run you, right? I mean, America's very best friend is Israel, but they still arrested Jonathan J. Pollard in the 80s for spying on them, right? Why aren't these people? If I was in there advocating that view towards China, I'd be roundly denounced as a traitor and and probably quickly arrested on some trumped up charge. They've brought this guy back from where he should be in bloody jail for what he did. They brought him back to pour out this garbage just before the premier arrived. And anyway, so I'm having this reaction. You're seeing the reaction I was having, right?
I am. I shouldn't have asked.
But then when I got to the end, I had an epiphany because he ended with 14 points.
Yes.
Of what China should do.
And it matched the 14 points what China said Australia should do.
I counted them first. I said there's 14. I thought, you're just trolling. This is trolling. Because China famously had a list of 14 grievances from 2020, and he's come up with 14, and it's just trolling.
Yeah.
Especially when one of them was China needs to open up to Western think tanks, including the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
China would welcome. Do you know, seriously, China would welcome them. Come and have a look. I mean, they invited the ABC last year, for goodness sake. I called the ABC out as a bunch of liars the other day because they wrote, again, this is all part of this anti-China around the Premier Li visit. The ABC wrote a scathing report about Xinjiang. And then in their report, they said it's very, very hard to travel there. It's restricted. And I pointed out that just 8 months ago, ABC were invited by the Chinese government to go and visit. And they did. And they couldn't find anything. So they wrote a scathing report about what they couldn't find because it was all hidden, of course. And they had sent, believe it or not, they didn't send an ABC reporter from Australia. They sent the head of the Washington bureau to Xinjiang to report on Xinjiang for the ABC. This is what we're faced with. This is where it is. But that 14-point thing, I raised it with John Lander the other day. I was chatting, our mutual friend John, who arrives in China today, or late last night, arrived in China. And I was supposed to see him in Beijing, but I've just run out of time. I can't travel. I've got too many other commitments. But yeah, John, I raised it with him. Did you notice there were 14 points? Yes, he picked up on that too.
Yeah, John and I had a chat. He got the first version of my rant.
Okay.
No, and so another point to make about the whole thing. This always happens coinciding with visits. So you'll have between visits, it's always background noise. There's plenty of crap going on, but at the time visits these visits are important. They're productive, right? So Premier Li is visiting Australia. The last person to visit was the foreign minister, Wang Yi. And Wang Yi's visit had been the highest level visit since the previous time Wang Yi had visited before COVID. Yeah. Right. So the two Wang Yi visits were the bookends of a very bad period. And then this visit by the Premier Li was the highest ranking visit since Xi Jinping. And so it's a really big deal that Premier Li is coming to Australia. And so what happens every time these visits are happening, there's a blizzard of these attacks, and it's all designed to undermine any potential that may come out of these events. And it happens when we go to China as well. And it's all deliberate, it's all coordinated. And they rolled out Vicky Xu and Drew Pavlu and Chang Lei, the Australian journalist who'd been detained in China. It was all a coordinated thing to try and undermine everything, but the Pizzullo one took the cake.
I didn't see your mate Squealer very much. He was fairly quiet. Drew Pavlu was during this period. I felt that he was quite restrained.
Well, no. What had happened was he got he actually had to get away from Twitter for a bit because he decided to fly to Perth and join the protests against Premier Li in Perth because he's in Brisbane, so he went to the other side of the country. So when you go to Perth, you're 4 hours on a plane, you're not on Twitter. So that's probably why you thought it was restrained. There was an article. There was a big article the day before Premier Li arrived, featuring Drew Pavlou and Vicky Xu, both claiming that a year earlier, the Australian Federal Police had told them that Chinese agents in Australia were trying to find out where they lived and they should take security precautions. But they also said in this article that the Federal Police had told them not to tell anybody. And so they made this claim in this article on the Saturday before last that this had supposedly happened with no evidence. And the fact that it's these two together, I'm reading this article and I'm seeing it's these two, and it's always these two, right? So despite all the effort that's been put into this undermine the relationship in terms of foot soldiers on the street that they can make causes out of, it's the same handful of people. They don't actually have a broad base of proof that there's all these problems going on. And Vicky Xu, of course, worked for ASPI. Drew may as well have worked. Drew's useful to them because he's such a nut. He does everything sort of for free.
Drew's never worked for anyone, has he?
No, I'm sure he finds ways to fund himself, but so he hasn't been on the ASPI payroll as far as I know. But nevertheless, he's been with that crowd going way back. So that was a big thing. That was a big splash on the Saturday about these. These anyone who dares to challenge China gets targeted. Yada yada yada. I'm thinking, well, if it's always the same people, and then they did this stunt with Chang Lei.
It was a stunt, yes.
Nothing but a stunt. Nothing but a stunt. And I have no respect for Chang Lei as a journalist. Should say because here's what it was is one of these things where the Australian media were able to say, "Oh, look, Chinese officials don't believe in freedom of the press. And how dare they think they can throw their weight around Parliament House?" Because what had happened was there was a document signing event, and it was just a photo op. So there was a room for the photo op, and the media were all invited in, and they got to set up there for the photo op to watch the Prime Minister and the Premier sign these memorandum of understanding. And Sky News, who employs Chang Lei now, Sky News is owned by Murdoch, and I was always suspicious why she got a job with Sky News when she got released as well. But the reason I say I don't respect her as a journalist because journalists are supposedly trying to find the truth of matters and bring transparency to the process. She won't bring transparency to her process because when she was interviewed by Sky News when she first got released, they asked her what had she been charged with, and she wouldn't say. And she indicated that it would be unsafe for her to say, except she served her time in China. She's now back in Australia. The Chinese can't touch her. They wanted the audience to think somehow she's under threat from China. No, she's clearly not. But when you consider, Jerry, that the two Michaels in Canada who were detained the same time she was, we were told they're innocent. These accusations of espionage are rubbish, but now they're released. They've been confirmed that the accusations were true. One of them has been compensated by the Canadian government. She's back in Australia. She will not reveal what she was charged with, and it leaves open the question: well, did she have a relationship with ASIO or an Australian agency that might have actually got her in trouble? Right. So she won't reveal, she won't be transparent about that. But now she's a journalist. It's a token job. She's got this boring Saturday afternoon slot on weekend, 24-hour news television. No one watches it. It's just a token thing from the Murdoch media. But she's based in Melbourne. This is an event in Canberra. Sky's got 100 journalists in Canberra to cover these events, but they fly her up from Melbourne. They put her in the room for this event. And sorry, waving my hands around as...
It went a bit fuzzy. Yeah.
They put her in the room, and then the Sky TV camera, instead of being focused on the Prime Minister and Premier like every other camera, focused on her.
Yes, yeah.
So the Chinese officials just went and stood beside the Sky camera, which blocked them from seeing her. And that's all they did. And we were told they blocked Chang Lei. They blocked her from participating in a press conference. No, it wasn't a press conference. They didn't block her from doing anything that every other journalist did, which is just sit there and watch. She did everything every other journalist did. They didn't block her from doing anything. They blocked the camera from this prearranged stuff looking at her.
And in fact, from the side, you could clearly see she had a very clear view of the two podiums.
Absolutely.
There was no issue there at all. No. And the guy was standing to one side.
Look, the only thing I'd say is the Chinese saw a stunt and they matched it. But you might argue they got sucked in because either way, it was going to be a thing, right? They were either going to get footage of Chang Lei and contrast it with the premier and make a big thing about that, or now they had a big thing about the Chinese officials blocking it. It was always something was going to come out of that. It was always a stunt designed to elicit something.
It was I described it as a setup. That
was my 100%. As if the media is some kind of sacred thing. I mean, they're all these mainstream guys. I'll tell you what, they're just sellouts. And there's nothing sacred about them. But anyway, people. Okay. I went hard on that.
One last question for you before we said we kind of cut this one a little shorter than usual. One last question for you, and I think again there's a connection with China here. Will Peter Dutton actually get the authority to nuclearize, if that's the right word, Australia? Because he's talking about scrapping the emissions goals and emissions targets and bringing nuclear power into the Australian energy production field. And to be quite honest, I think that's not a bad idea. I mean, Australia's got the perfect opportunity for solar, but nuclear, who would he work with? The French, the Americans, or the Chinese? Because the French probably lead this.
That's a good one. Well, yeah, maybe the French, except he was part of the government that scrapped the French subs deal, so that may not happen. Look, I'm pro-nuclear too, right? I mean, we talk about Australia's advantages. We've got all this solar and wind, but we've also got most of the world's uranium reserves in this country, right? Yeah. That's an enormous advantage. The thing is, though, Dutton is only suddenly pro-nuclear because the AUKUS deal means we're going to be nuclear whether we like it or not, right? If we get these nuclear submarines, we're going to be nuclear. We're going to have a waste disposal, a high-level nuclear waste repository, whether we like it or not. That's going to happen. And to their argument, and I, in a sense, agree with this argument. Well, if we're going to have weapons, which is, everything is dual use. You can have good and bad with everything. If we're going to have the bad and deny ourselves the good of actually, plentiful power, then that's just crazy. Now, in Australia, we have a very distorted debate because we've got this is where I do have a difference with a lot of my fellow peace campaigners, and the Citizens Party does, because they tend to hail they tend to be a bit longer in the tooth and hail from the wars of the 70s and 80s over the anti-nuclear wars, anti-uranium and all that kind of stuff. But, one thing that makes me unhappy about the debate in Australia is that it's waged in such a way that the people who I otherwise agree with, the way they talk and the accusations they throw at the other side, the implication is about 50 countries in the world are utter lunatics. The 50 countries in the world who are all nuclear are utter lunatics. And I'm sorry, they're not. Right? There's, the country in the world that is an utter lunatic on nuclear is Germany.
Right.
Because of something that happened on the other side of the world, it turned off all its nuclear plants and went back to burning brown coal. I mean, that is absolute lunacy. That's the kind of lunacy that defines the debate in Australia. And I'm talking about people I otherwise agree with, who I'm in the trenches with trying to stop war with China. Anyway, not to get too carried away, I'll calm down. But whether Dutton succeeds, the problem is I just wish it was anyone other than Dutton, jumping on this. But for him, it's all about the reality of the AUKUS thing. We shouldn't have the AUKUS thing, right? The AUKUS thing is the problem, and I will fight that to my dying breath. However real that might be, there's a whole debate about whether AUKUS, in terms of the delivery of submarines, is going to happen anyway. But put that aside, just say it happens. It's totally ridiculous, totally unnecessary. It's not going to defend Australia one iota. It's going to be used to start a war with, we'll be using them as attack submarines, not as defensive submarines.
Yes.
And that's what we're going to keep fighting. And he will either succeed in getting a policy up if he gets elected. I would not, even though I'm pro-nuclear, this would not be enough for me to support him at all.
No.
I still firmly, in Australia with preferential voting, you ultimately have to be one side or the other. Your votes will go one side or the other. As disappointed as I am in Albanese and whatever, this war danger issue means that there's no way I want Dutton as Prime Minister of Australia. No way, no how. And I don't care if I agree with him superficially on nuclear power. No way, no how. If the Liberals want to put in a decent leader, that might change the equation, but they don't. They've got him. And yeah, so whether he gets it up or not, if he gets it up, well, that may be an issue. That it'll be what it is. If he doesn't get it up, he might actually do enormous damage to the reputation of nuclear power. And parties like me will have to go back to basics just to try and explain the technology to people. But that's with him, he's bad news. Pizzullo's partner in crime.
Your next election is before September of next year, so you've got about 14 months, 15 months maximum. It could happen any time between then and now, but the next election is at most September of next year. I'm not going to ask you to crystal ball which way it will go, but I think the way I view Australian politics right now, I think it's going to be very much Greens and Teals picking up seats rather than Albanese or Dutton's parties picking up seats. What do you think?
I agree. Teals / whatever might be an alternative. In the lower house, bigger crossbench in the lower house, bigger crossbench in the upper house.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's not just those two types of entities.
No, well, hopefully the Citizens Party's in there too.
The Citizens Party, for sure. But despite me saying that, even if it is, that's still a net positive. The more voices we have in both chambers that are not the major parties, the better. And right now, Albanese is staring down the barrel of a minority government where he would have to govern with the Teals or with the Greens.
Yes.
And that's not the end of the world. It's just not, right? He would have to moderate. He would have to get better on some things, and hopefully, including some foreign policy issues.
Okay. So in summary, is the relationship with China and Australia going to remain the same, get better, or perhaps decline further?
Well, it is getting better.
Good.
And this is in the policy of stabilizing the relationship. So it is getting better, but I still credit the Chinese side for most of that. And so, because it was the Chinese side who finally got sick of all the rubbish that led to 2020 and said, okay, we're just not going to let this go anymore. And it started long before 2020. It started long before COVID. It was long before Morrison called for an investigation to COVID. There were we had a free trade agreement with China, but the Australian side hit China with 117 anti-dumping complaints at the WTO before China hit back with its first one against barley. And that was in 2018. And that was in a reaction to those complaints. And that was in a reaction to us demonizing Huawei. So the Chinese were the ones who finally said enough, and the relationship then spiraled down. It's the Chinese who greeted the arrival of Albanese and say, okay, we're prepared to have a start fresh, right? Take you on your merits, and the relationship has improved. Albanese hasn't done a lot, except he's been prepared to go to the meetings and whatever. He has to deal with this feral media, though, that try and do stunts like the Chung Lei stunt. So he can be in a bit of a tough position. As long as he holds that line, and the Chinese have a lot of goodwill, I think it will continue to improve. That's my view right now. But our side of that is very fragile.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with it. It is very, very fragile. So on that happy note, I'm going to let you get on with the rest of your day. And thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Jerry.
much for your time and your insights into everything that's going on there. And good luck with your getting your committee or panel. I don't know what you
Yeah.
call that with the banking system and Christine
Watch
Holgate
with
on there.
interest. Keep an eye on that. You'll look out for signs of that.
Yep,
You'll
and,
know.
and everybody should keep an eye on both Robbie Barwick and the Citizens Party and really learn what's really happening in Australian politics.
Yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
Jerry.
No, thank you. And also thank you to the 200 people who came to watch us and the people who've given me these superstars. I appreciate it now that I'm actually monetized for the first time. But thank you, everybody, and see you again next time. Bye for now. So we're going to take about 3 seconds to depart this screen now.